We are live. It's been a while. It's been a while. But we are live. What are we looking into? In the city of Brahman, in a secret dwelling, the lotus of the heart. Within this dwelling is a space, and within that space, a fulfillment of our desires. What is within that space should be longed for and realized. As great as the infinite space beyond is the space within the lotus of heart. Both heaven and earth are contained in that inner space, both fire and air. Sun and moon, lighting and stars, whether we know it in this world or know it not, everything is contained in this inner space. Never fear that old age will invade that city. Never fear that this inner treasure of all reality will wither and decay. There's no age when the body ages. There's no dying when the body dies. This is the real city of Brahman. This is the self. Free from old age, from death and grief, hunger and thirst. In the self, all desires are fulfilled. It's been a while. Yesterday I was with my friend, and this is exactly what we needed. This is exactly what I needed from Vancouver. It's not even Vancouver, this is exactly what I needed. Like, we were just out there, we were talking, we were hopping, we were very interesting conversation, about everything. And that is what I felt like I was missing, and I had it. Now what's next? So what's next? You want to keep going. You want to keep having experiences like this. So what's next? It's really important to find these things that truly matters and then start recreating that. What are the establishments around the world that are based around conversations? So this is again very interesting. Like in Vancouver, I had the sauna spot, and it was again the same thing. For 1 hour, 1.5 hour, 2 hours, you're sitting over there in a warm environment and you're just talking. Over here, the difference is that now you have more agency. You have more agency to change your environment. So you're in a car, you're going around the city, you are like, okay, I want to go here, and you just keep going for 3 hours, and you are hitting all the spots, you're hitting all the coffee spots, and you're just moving. There's this movement. The Viennese Cafe House is probably the archetype of place where the price of a single coffee buys you a chair, a stack of newspapers, and limited time to argue, write, or simply watch people. Freud, Trotsky, and Kim all worked out. All of them, UNESCO actually inscribed the Viennese Coffee House tradition on its list of intangible cultural heritage. The Viennese Cafe House. Oh, horse. Coffee house. Let's see. Okay, this is good that ChatGPT actually gives images. I don't know why Claude isn't yet giving images. Wow, beautiful. Beautiful. Parisian cafes played a similar role, especially on the left bank, where Sartre, Beauvoir, and Camus made places like Café des Fleurs and Le Deux Magots into informal philosophy departments. The earlier French salon tradition, hosted in private homes by women like Madame de Staël, was its more aristocratic ancestor. English pubs, public houses, and especially 17th century London coffee houses were so conversation driven that they were nicknamed penny universities. Pay a penny for coffee, listen to the talk for free. English pubs. Lloyd's of London literally began as a coffee house for shipping merchants. The Ottoman Turkish Cafe Han and the broader Middle Eastern Kahve Kahne were centers of poetry, storytelling, and political talks for centuries, so much so that authorities periodically tried to ban them. The modern Shisha Lounge is a descendant. The modern Shisha Lounge. This is so interesting. This is exactly like some people thinking that what you're truly going for is just the coffee. But no, you're not going for coffee. You're going for the conversation. You're going for the environment. You're going for this aesthetic place that opens up your brain, that opens up your mind, which leads to expansion of mind. What you're looking for is expansion. Of mind. You're looking for conversations. You're looking for an experience that changes the way how you think. And that is what matters, not a $5 coffee. It's not the $5 coffee. It's something else. Okay, let me fix the lighting. Okay, way better. Way better lighting. Wow. Okay, this is how you fix things. This is how you fix things slowly. Slow and steady. Okay, one more fix. Boom. All right. You're here. You're here. Let's go. The Ottoman Turkish Kahve Hind and the broader Middle Eastern Kahve Kane were set as a poetry, storytelling, and political talk for centuries, so much so that authorities periodically tried to ban the modern shisha lounge to listen. Exactly, same with shisha. It's not. Shisha doesn't mean that all you like is smoke. It is just the thing that brings people together, and then you sit down and then you talk. And that's what matters. That's what matters. Let me check. Spanish tertulias are recurring conversation gatherings, often in a specific cafe and a specific hour, dedicated to a theme. Literature, bullfighting, politics. Greek cafeteria play a comparable village role. Japanese izakaya function as conversation spaces after work, with food and drink almost a pretext. With food and conversation almost a pretext. The Kisaten old style coffee shops serve a quieter, more contemplative version of the same idea. Okay, let's move a bit. So we are in the middle. Alright, better. Japanese izakaya function as conversation spaces after work, with the food and drink almost a pretext. The Kisata and old style coffee shops serve quite a more contemplative version of the same idea. Ethiopian coffee ceremonies turn the act of brewing into hours of conversation among neighbors. The social unit is the ceremony itself on the cafe. Ethiopian coffee ceremonies turn the act of brewing into hours of conversation among neighbors. The social unit is the ceremony itself on the cafe. Argentine cafes, especially in Buenos Aires, where the term cafe notable designates legally protected ones, and Italian bars and piazzas function as extensions of the living room. Brazilian botecos do similar work in a rowdier register. Turn the act of brewing into hours of conversation among neighbors. The social unit is the ceremony itself on the cafe. Argentine cafes, especially in Buenos Aires, with the term cafe notable designates legally protected ones, and Italian bars and piazzas function as extensions of the living room. Brazilian botecos do similar work in a rowdy register. What is Brazilian botecos? Let's see. With AI, what is happening now? What is more important? What's more important is what is now more important? what's more important is the human intelligence. It's very interesting when we talk about intelligence deployment. It's not just artificial intelligence deployment. It's also human intelligence deployment. You are also looking for ways how this is very interesting. This reminds me of Brett Adcock. I don't know why I'm thinking about that, but Brett Adcock, it reminds me of the figure experiment they're doing where they're live streaming. They're live streaming a robot and a man and a kid sorting out packages. And now they are going to be, and now they are trying to understand that, okay, and they're trying to show that who is better at it. Like, obviously, a robot is way better at it because it can just run forever. The difference is, and I don't know why he's doing that, because it's like, you know that the robot can just keep going, and you have to show that the robot can just keep going, and you have to show that the robot is just on for 24 hours. And you have to just figure this out, that okay, one robot is working. The moment, like 1 hour, like 30 minutes before its battery dies, just bring another robot and send this first one for recharge and let this other one work, and just keep going like that. And keep swapping the robots. And just show people how this can just work 24 hours, do this very menial task that a human had to do early on, and that's it. And I think what they have to also show, what they have to really, I think what's also going to happen is that for Figure to try to sell this to Amazon or try to sell this out to someone who is going to say to its people that, hey, we are replacing you with robots, they have to work through they have to figure out a lot of politics, a lot of human relations, a lot of, what's the word? A lot of union conversations. Instead, what makes much more sense is if you yourself go out and build a factory. If you yourself go out and build a factory as a prototype, you can learn from people. You can be like, hey, we are building a demo that we're going to show to you. With that pretext, if you go out and build, you are not going to, because you are building everything from ground up, you're not going to have a lot of backlash. But for someone to fire their employees and replace it with your robots, it is a lot more friction, it is a lot more change management. I'm surprised why Claude doesn't show images. Look at this. A few less obvious ones worth knowing: Indian chai stalls and the Irani cafes. Indian chai stalls. Yeah, in India it's chai. In India it's chai. Chai pe charcha. Chai is big. Irani cafes are Mumbai. Moroccan tea houses, your German Stammtisch, a reserved table, a regular pub where the same group meets weekly. And the Soviet era Russian Kuchnia, the kitchen, which became the de facto venue for honest political conversation when public space was unsafe for it. Tell me more about this. The Soviet era Russian Kuchnia. Let's see. The Mandukya Upanishad. Om stands for the supreme reality. It is a symbol for what was, what is, what shall be. Om represents all what lies beyond past, present, and future consciousness and its phases. One could only study a single Upanishad, it should be this one, and we can see why. In its succinctness, the Mandukya captures the essentials of mystical insight. One of the four Upanishadic Mahavakyas, great sayings that are packed into a brief formulaic utterance, occurs in the second verse. I am Atma Brahma, the self is Brahman. This is probably why a much later text from tells a devotee that the Mandukya alone is sufficient for deliverance, though less advanced seekers will have to read the 10 principal Upanishads, or 32, or all 108. The 12 verses of the Mandukya revolve around a fundamental proposition underlying the entire Vedantic worldview and mysticism generally, that one reality, called Brahman in the Upanishads, has become the infinite variety of shifting things that we experience around us in the universe or within us as the various states of our own consciousness. The latter field of investigation forms the first of two passes through this basic idea that make up this text. In this pass, we are walked through the four states of consciousness that we all experience: the waking state, the dreaming sleep, the dreamless sleep, in which the autonomic nervous system resets, and finally an indescribable state of consciousness. The text calls simply Turiya, the fourth. The waking state, the dreaming sleep, the dreamless sleep, in which the autonomic nervous system rests. Dreamless sleep. Turiya. Like many such series in the Upanishads, these stages are steps from the everyday reality to the supreme experience. In this final state of sense of I is temporarily suspended. Surprisingly, the Upanishad tells us that we enter this state regularly. If we could only be aware of it every night, we are like someone unknowingly walking back and forth over a buried treasure, so near and yet so far. But you have already been told in the opening verse that the supreme reality into which we merge in the fourth state is also represented by the sacred syllable Om. So the sage takes another pass through the stages of being read three words, where orders of reality are seen in the sounds of the sacred syllable Om, and it is manifested in the phenomenal world. It is very common for Upanishad to present us with multiple passes like this through levels of reality, reminiscent of what in the Middle Ages was called the Great Chain of Being. What is different here is that the Mandukya hints that there is a way to climb the chain. Om stands for the mantra, a form of sacred utterance like the repetition of a name of God used in every major spiritual tradition to still the mind and become aware of the divine reality of which it refers. All mantras according to the Mandukya go back to Om and then beyond even that primordial energy to Brahman, the ultimate goal of spiritual progress. So the Upanishad first gives us an inspiring picture of that which is, reassuring us that reality is not limited to the world of changing phenomena, and then hints at an everyday doable way to reascend the orders of being and regain our spiritual home in the changeless. Shankara did well to praise its the condensed power of this Upanishad. May we hear only what is good for all. May we see only what is good for all. May we serve you, Lord of love, all of life. May we be used to spread our peace on earth. Om stands for the supreme reality, the symbol of what was, what is, and what shall be. Om represents also what lies beyond past, present, and future. Brahman is all, and the self is Brahman. The self has four states of consciousness. The first is called Vaishvanara, in which one lives with all the senses turned outward, aware only of the external world. Tejas is the name of the second. The dreaming state in which, with the senses turned inward, one enacts the impressions of past deeds and present desires. The third state is called Prajna, of deep sleep, in which one neither dreams nor desires. There is no mind in Prajna, there is no separateness, but the sleeper is not. Conscious of this, let him become conscious. In Prajna, it will open the door to the state of abiding joy. Prajna, all powerful and all knowing, dwells in the hearts of all as a ruler. Prajna is the source and end of all. The fourth is the superconscious state called Turiya, neither inward nor outward, beyond the senses and the intellect, in which there is none other than the Lord. He is the supreme goal of life. He is infinite peace and love. Realize Him. Turiya is represented by Om. Though indivisible, it has three sounds. A stands for Vaishvanar. Those who know this through mastery of the senses obtain the fruit of their desires and attain greatness. U indicates Tejas. Those who know this by mastering even their dreams become established in wisdom. In their family, everyone leads a spiritual life. Those who know this by mastering even their dreams become established in wisdom. In their family, everyone leads a spiritual life. M corresponds to Prajna. Those who know this by stilling the mind find their true stature and inspire everyone around to grow. The mantra Om stands for the supreme state of Turiya without parts, beyond birth and death, symbol of everlasting joy. Those who know Om as the self become the self. Truly, they become the self. True stature inspire everyone around to grow. M corresponds to Prajna. Those who know this by stilling their mind find the true stature inspire everyone around to grow. E stands for Vaishvara. Those who know this through mastery of the senses obtain the fruit of their desires and attain greatness. U indicates Tejas. Those who know this by mastering in their dreams become established in wisdom in their family or one leads a spiritual life. The Kena Upanishad. The light of Brahman flashes in lightning. The Kuknia is a social institution really crystallized in the late 50s and 60s, and the reason is almost comically architectural. Under Khrushchev, the Soviet state launched a massive housing program, the prefab apartment blocks known as Khrushchevki, which for the first time gave many ordinary families their own separate flat instead of a room in communalka, the communal environment shared with strangers. In a communalka, the kitchen was a battleground shared with 4 or 5 of the families, watched by neighbors, sometimes literally policed by an appointed responsible tenant. You could not speak freely there. The Khrushchevka kitchen, by contrast, was tiny, usually 5 or 6 square meters, but it was yours. The tininess turned out to matter. The kitchen was the room farthest from the front door, the room where you could plausibly turn on the tap or a radio to mask voices, the room where the phone usually wasn't, and the room where having people over at 1 in the morning didn't require an explanation beyond tea. Living rooms felt semi-public. Workplaces had informers. Telephones presumed to be tapped. The kitchen was the last node of trustable space. In the room where having people over at 1 in the morning didn't require an explanation beyond tea. The kitchen was the last untrustable space. So that's where everything happened. People read some is that there, typewritten carbon copies of Solzhenitsyn, Akhmatova, Brodsky, Bulgakov, banned philosophy, banned theology, translated Orwell. They listened to Magnet is That, the bootleg reel-to-reel tapes of the Bard singers, Wysotsky, Okudzava. Why? What were all the reasons why certain philosophies were banned in certain countries at certain times? The kitchen was... So that's where everything happened. They argued about Zionism, religious revival, the war in Afghanistan, the latest Politburo gossip, that drank tea and then vodka and then more tea. The term Kukonaya intelligentsia, kitchen intelligentsia, came to describe an entire stratum of educated people whose real intellectual life happened in those 6 square meters, because their official life at the institute or the newspaper required them to say things they didn't believe. There were rituals. You smoked at the window or in the stairwell. Long pauses were normal. The conversations were called Kukunai, Razgobori, kitchen talks, and the genre had its own conventions, confessional, digressive, fueled by something between desperation and joy. Svetlana Byom, who wrote one of the best books on Soviet everyday life, called the kitchen kind of domestic public square, a substitute civil society that the state could not quite reach into. There's also melancholy postscript when the USSR collapsed and people could finally say anything anywhere. The kitchen lost its monopoly on honesty. Many Russians of the generation will tell you how joking the conversations were better when they were dangerous. That scarcity of free speech had concentrated into something more intense than what replaced it. Whether that's true or just nostalgia is its own kitchen argument. Wow. You smoked at the window or in the stairwell. I think it's people want to do things that are dangerous. People like... Wow. Why do people like to do things that are dangerous, that feel dangerous? There's a need for danger. There's a need to do something that's dangerous. Melancholy postscript. And the genre had its own conventions, confessional, digressive, fueled by something between desperation and joy. Svetlana Byom, who wrote one of the best books on Soviet everyday life, called the kitchen a kind of domestic public sphere, substitute civil society that the state could not quite reach into. There's also melancholy postscript When the USSR collapsed and people could finally say anything anywhere, vacation lost its monopoly on honesty. Many Russians of the generation will tell you how joking the conversations were better when they were dangerous. That scarcity of free speech had concentrated into something more intense than what replaced it. A substitute society that the state could not quite reach into. There's also melancholy postscript. Why? What were all the reasons why certain philosophies were banned? This is so interesting. People love danger. The reasons cluster into a handful of recurring patterns, and most actual bans involve more than one of them stacked on top of each other. Threat to political legitimacy is the most common driver. Philosophy gets suppressed because if widely accepted, it would imply the current rulers shouldn't be ruling. Philosophy gets suppressed because if widely accepted, it would imply the current ruler should be ruling. The Soviet ban on basically every non-Marxist thinker and on deviant Marxists like Trotsky falls here, as does the Tsarist regime's earlier suppression of German liberal thought and Russian translations of Mill. The American Red Scares of 19 to 20 and the McCarthy era criminalized Marxism on the same logic in reverse. Anarchism has been banned in nearly every state that ever existed, which tells you something about anarchism. Sometimes the threat is more specific. Plato's Republic was periodically restricted in democratic regimes. Sometimes the threat is more specific. Plato's Republic was periodically restricted in democratic regimes for its anti-democratic argument. The Chinese Cultural Revolution attacked Confucius not as a religious figure but because Confucian hierarchy implied a legitimacy that didn't run through Mao. Threat to political legitimacy. Threat to religious authority is nearly as old. The Catholic Church Index Librorum Prohibitorum, enforced from 59 to 66, eventually included Descartes, Spinoza, Hume, Locke, Kant, Voltaire, Rousseau, and Mill, an extraordinary roster that essentially declared modern philosophy off limits to faithful Catholics. Spinoza was also banned and excommunicated by the Amsterdam Jewish community, which is the rare case of a philosopher being banned by two religious traditions at once. Al-Ghazali's Incoherence of the Philosophers, kind of intellectual ban on Aristotelian rationalism. Averroes' response was eventually answered by actual book burnings in Andalusia. Galileo's case is famous. That's because heliocentrism. What would the world look like if the books of Andalusia weren't burned? Wow, very good, very good. Visceral flow is really good. Visceral flow is getting really, really good. I'm really happy. Islamic Andalusia had survived, the world would probably feel less like a sequence of disconnected civilization rebirths and more like one long continuous conversation. The destruction people usually point to is gradual loss of intellectual world centered around places like fall of Granada, early waves of censorship and book burnings under both Almoravid and Almohad rule, but the deeper tragedy was cumulative. Libraries dispersed, scholars exiled, translation networks shattered, and the social infrastructure for inquiry dissolved. Europe's Renaissance may have started earlier and differently. Europe's Renaissance may have started earlier and differently. Andalusia was not just preserving Greek knowledge, it was expanding it. Thinkers like Ibn Rushd, Ibn Tufail, and Maimonides were building a multilingual intellectual ecosystem where Arabic, Hebrew, Latin vernacular traditions cross-pollinated. Europe eventually rediscovered Aristotle partly through Andalusia. If that ecosystem had remained intact for another few centuries, scholasticism might have become more empirical earlier. The split between science and spirituality may have been less sharp. There is no split between science and spirituality. There is no split between science and spirituality. Science and spirituality are the same thing. You can keep going deeper. It's one is the Eastern way to find the answer. The other is the Western way to find the answer, and you need both. You need both. The middle way, but again, you don't know where the middle is until you explore the extremes. So you have to go to the extremes to figure out what is the middle way. That is it. Universities might have inherited a more synthesis-oriented tradition rather than a church versus science adversarial dynamic. Instead of the Renaissance feeling like a dramatic recovery of lost knowledge, it may have felt like version 4.0 of an already living network. The Islamic world might have remained scientifically central. One underappreciated point: civilizations decline. This is again very similar. Even with the middle way, the middle way is the answer. You have to explore the extremes. The extremes are one-line tweets, one-line shit posts, shit post, one-line shit posts, and 500-year-old books. The answer is the middle way. One underappreciated point: civilizations decline intellectually not only because books vanish, but because prestige migrates. After Andalusia's collapse, intellectual gravity slowly shifted away from open-ended philosophy toward more conservative legal and theological traditions in many regions, not everywhere, but enough to matter. If Andalusia survives, philosophy keeps higher status. Rational inquiry remains socially prestigious. Rational inquiry remains socially prestigious. Scientific institutions compound instead of fragment. And the Islamic world may stay a co-equal center of innovation through the scientific revolution. You could imagine observatories in Cordoba rivaling Florence, early mechanical engineering accelerating, navigational science exploding, medicine advancing continuously rather than in interrupted bursts. History is often path dependent in surprisingly fragile ways. One surviving library can become a civilization scale a seed crystal. History is often power dependent, surprisingly fragile ways. One surviving library can become a civilizational scale seed crystal. Jewish, Muslim, Christian coexistence may become may have become a stronger civilization model. Well, Andalus, sometimes romanticized beyond reality, was not a utopia. There were tensions, persecutions, and power struggles, but compared to much of medieval Europe, it still represented a remarkably porous intellectual environment. A surviving Andalusian model could have provided a long-term example of multilingual cities, mixed scholarly traditions, translation as prestige and identity, organized less around purity and more around participation in shared inquiry. Imagine the default prestigious city for centuries was not ethnically homogeneous empire capitals, but hybrid conversation cities. The modern world might feel less trapped in civilizational binaries. Colonial history may have unfolded Colonial history may have unfolded differently. This got speculated but interesting. The same Spain that expelled Jews and Muslims became one of the engines of imperial Catholic expansion. The Reconquista mentality flowed outward into the Americas. If Iberia remained intellectually and religiously plural longer, Spanish identity itself changes, imperial ideology changes, perhaps colonial extraction becomes less absolutist, perhaps race categories harden differently, not necessarily kinder. History rarely upgrades so neatly but different. We might have inherited more lost books. This is the haunting part. We don't fully know what vanished. Medieval sources describe libraries in Cordoba containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Some claims are exaggerated, but even conservative estimates imply enormous loss. Commentaries on Greek works now missing. Astronomical observations, medieval techniques, philosophical schools we no longer know existed. Poems, maps, engineering designs, entire chains of debate that simply snapped. Usually remembered by the books that survived, not the minds that existed. Born library and future generations must take survival for completeness. The same deeper forces still emerge: centralized states, orthodoxy, colonial competition, industrial capitalism, nationalism. Libraries do not automatically defeat power. Knowledge survives physically while the culture capable of metabolizing it dies anyway. A bookshelf can become a fossil. Still, when you look at Cordoba at its height, or the translation schools of Toledo, or the philosophical chain running from Aristotle, Baghdad, Andalusia, Paris, you glimpse an alternate civilization moved, a world where culture is completed partly by producing better conversations rather than merely stronger armies. The smoke from burned libraries is not just paper turning black, it is possibility becoming counterfactual. Less because heliocentrism was new, it wasn't, then because this philosophical method threatened the church's authority over how truth gets established at all. Threat to moral and social order is more diffuse but recurring. Epicureanism was suppressed across the late Roman and Christian world, less for its physics than for its perceived hedonism. Satan was banned everywhere, including under Napoleon. Nietzsche was restricted in various contexts, first as immoralist, later ironically bored by the Nazis and the post-war denazification effort. The Qing dynasty banned Nietzsche. Nietzsche was very interesting. Okay, banned certain Ming-era erotic and skeptical works as corrupting to public morals. The category shades into censorship of literature, but the underlying philosophy, skepticism, materialism, individualism are usually the real target. The category shades into censorship of literature, but the underlying philosophies, skepticism, materialism, individualism are usually the real target. threat to the economic order can be hard to separate from political threat, but it's distinct enough to mention. Hayek and Friedman were unavailable. Hayek and Friedman were unavailable in the USSR, not just because they were anti-communist, but because their entire framework presupposed well, it's distinct enough to mention Hayek and Friedman were unavailable in the USSR, not just because they were anti-communist, but because their entire framework presupposed market coordination as natural. Liberation theology was actively suppressed in several Latin American regimes in the 70s and 80s because the synthesis of Christianity in Marxist economics was politically destabilizing in a way pure Marxism wouldn't have been. It could reach the devout poor. Radical and civilizational ideology drove some of the most bizarre cases. Nazi Germany banned Jewish physics, meaning Einstein's relativity, and Jewish philosophy, meaning much of the Frankfurt School, Herschel, and Cassirer banned that crippled German science for decades. Stalin's USSR did something structurally similar with Lysenkoism. Mendelian genetics was banned as bourgeois pseudoscience. Meaning much of the Frankfurt School, Herschel, and Cassirer banned that crippled German science for decades. Stalin's USSR did something structurally similar with Lysenkoism. Mendelian genetics was banned as bourgeois pseudoscience because it conflicted with the preferred ideological picture of malleable human nature. Biologists who taught it were imprisoned or shot. Because it conflicted with the preferred ideological picture of malleable human nature. Biologists who taught it were imprisoned or shot. Post-war Germany voted the move, banning Nazi philosophy itself, which remains illegal to propagate. Foreign contamination is the rationale where the philosophy is treated as a cultural intrusion. Tokugawa Japan's Sakoku policy restricted Western philosophical and religious works for 2 centuries on these grounds. Qing China oscillated between embracing and banning Western learning for similar reasons. Khomeini's Iran in the early 1980s purged universities of secular Western philosophy as part of the Cultural Revolution. In the South, the religious authorities long restricted the teaching of philosophy as such, on the grounds that it was a Greek import. Persian University of Secular Western Philosophy is part of the Cultural Revolution, and Saudi religious authorities long restricted the teaching of philosophy as such, on the grounds that it was a Greek import that compromised Islamic epistemology. The Chinese state today restricts what it calls the seven unmentionables, which include constitutional democracy and universal values, on a recognizable version of the same logic. Late Qing China oscillated between embracing and banning Western learning for similar reasons. Khomeini's Iran in the early 1980s purged University of Secular Western Philosophy as part of the Cultural Revolution, and Saudi religious authorities long restricted the teaching of philosophy as such. Teaching of philosophy as such, on the grounds that it was a Greek import that compromised Islamic epistemology. The Chinese state today restricts what it calls the seven unmentionables, which includes constitutional democracy and universal values, and a recognizable version of the same logic. Personal and symbolic reasons. Show up underneath all of these. Rulers banned philosophies that teachers liked and they hated, or to signal allegiance to a faction or because some philosopher personally insulted them. The Qin emperors during 13 BCE burning of the Confucian classics had a coherent legalist rationale, but was also a settling of scores with the scholarly class. Sometimes the ban is mostly performative, a way to mark cultural territory rather than actually stop people reading. The Kukni ended up where it did. Several different things are usually tangled together when we say people like danger, and pulling them apart helps. The shallowest layer is neurochemical. A real or imagined threat fires the sympathetic nervous system, adrenaline, cortisol. Real or imagined threat fires the sympathetic nervous system, adrenaline, cortisol, and then drops you into a dopamine and endorphin backwash that feels biochemically a lot like joy. And then drops you into a dopamine and endorphin backwash that feels biochemically a lot like joy. The hangover from genuine fear is the hangover from genuine fear is one of the more pleasant states the body produces, which is part of why people pay for roller coasters and horror films. But chemistry alone can't be the answer, because a pill that delivered the same cocktail wouldn't satisfy a mountaineer. The danger has to be danger to do its work. So there's an existential layer on top. Living things feel most alive when they might plausibly stop being alive. Heidegger gave the rigorous version. Most of the time, we drift in an average out everydayness, and only confrontation with finitude shakes us into a genuine relation to our own existence. Tolstoy's Ivan Ilyich is dying for 100 pages and only becomes a real person on page 98. Sebastian Junger has written about combat veterans. Wow, 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 wow. Ivan is dying for 100 pages and only becomes a real person on page 98. That is so cool. Sebastian Junger has written about combat veterans who, after the worst experience of their lives, feel a confusing homesickness for the front. Not for the killing, but for how vivid everything was. Climbers will tell you that ordinary life feels muffled for weeks after a serious rout. There's also the aesthetic of the sublime, which Burke and Can carved out in the 18th century. Specific pleasure produced by vast threatening things, storms, oceans, cliffs. Contemplated from a position of bracketed safety. Most danger entertainment lives in this zone. The terror is real but contained. It's not danger that's loved so much as a particular operation the mind performs on danger. One it cannot perform on a calm afternoon. Costly signaling explains a chunk of the rest. Surviving something hard tells other people and tells yourself what kind of creature you are. The young male's cue in extreme sports is not coincidental. Identities on display. You don't know what you are until something tries to stop you, and people will pay quite a lot to find out. You don't know what you are until something tries to stop you. Flow is another piece. Csikszentmihalyi noticed that activities people report as most satisfying tend to involve sharp consequences for failure. Surgeons, climbers, fighter pilots, chess masters playing for money. Surgeons, climbers, fighter pilots, chess masters playing for money. Danger pins attention. It silences the inner monologue. Meditators and climbers and soldiers describe the resulting state in suspiciously similar language. Time changes. The self thins out. Everything is here. For people whose ordinary mental life is noisy or painful, an activity that demands total presence is a medicine you can't get any other way. Then there's the safety paradox, which is one of the strangest patterns in modern life. The safer a society becomes, the safer the society becomes, the more its members invent artificial danger. Mortality drops. The safer a society becomes, the more its members invent artificial danger. Mortality drops, life expectancy climbs, and base jumping appears. Pascal saw this coming in 1670. All of humanity's problems stem from our inability to sit quietly in a room alone, and meant that we will reach for almost anything, including catastrophe, rather than face our own undistracted minds. A life smoothed off every sharp edge often feels from the inside like a slightly suffocating dream. A life smoothed off every sharp edge. This is the reason people gamble. This is the reason people do things, because they are looking for that edge. They want to explore that edge. Life smooth of every sharp edge often feels from the inside like a slightly suffocating dream. This is also where your earlier thread reconnects. The Kuknia conversations were better because they were dangerous, partly because danger forces a person a kind of attention and honesty that comfort doesn't reward. People who live through dissident periods describe a quality of friendship they can reproduce later. Not because they want the KGB back, but because shared risk made other people more real. The same logic shows up in foxholes, in disaster zones, in early stage startups, in any setting where things actually matter and could actually fail. The crucial distinction running through all of this is between danger and chosen danger. People do not love being mugged. They love conditions they have stepped into voluntarily, can theoretically step out of, and have the skill to navigate, even when the navigating could kill them. The climber doesn't want to die, she wants to almost die, and to be the cause of almost. The actually frightened and have the skill to navigate even when the navigating could kill them. The climber doesn't want to die, she wants to almost die to be the cause of the almost. The actually frightened person doesn't want danger, the bored, numb, or under tested person does. The reason this confuses people is that most of us at some point in our lives are each of those. This is so interesting. I feel like even for me, the idea of leaving Vancouver, leaving Canada, and moving back to India, moving to network school, this was me facing danger because my life in Vancouver became too comfortable and I became too numb. Surviving something hard tells other people and tells yourself what kind of creature you are. The young male's cue in extreme sports is not coincidental. A life smooth of every sharp edge often feels from the inside like a slightly suffocating dream. Slightly suffocating dream. Harder version of the move because it doesn't end. A roller coaster or a hard climb gives you 60 seconds or 6 hours of intensity, and then you go home. Relocating your whole life to a place that asks more of you every morning is danger you can't step out of without admitting defeat. This part of one makes it actually work as an answer to numbness, and part of one makes it more serious than most things people reach for when they feel muffled. Anchor is almost a case study in this specific kind of comfort that produces what you are describing. It's beautiful, safe, expensive. It's beautiful, safe, expensive, polite, professionalized, and there's a quite civic consensus that nothing too interesting should happen. Plenty of people there feel the muffling and never name it, or name it and stay anyway because comfort is generally hard to leave. Naming it and acting on it is the rare move, and it usually only happens once you've understood that the muffling has a real cost, even if no individual day looks bad. Linear direction is also its own thing, separate from regular migration in either direction. Reverse moves like that are only the diaspora route story because India isn't a homecoming so much as a place that demands constant negotiation. Traffic, family, bureaucracy, weather, density of contact, the sheer number of people having opinions about you. Wow, interesting. Traffic, family, bureaucracy, weather, density of contact, the sheer number of people having opinions about you. People who do it well often describe exactly what you're describing in reverse. The noise comes back on. The signal to noise ratio drops, but you had take that over signal to zero any day. Network school layers something else on top. A chosen group of people who are also trying not to drift, which usually matters more than the geography in the long run. One thing worth saying, mostly because you sound like you would already half know it, chasing the antidote to numbness can quietly turn into its own pattern, where each level of intensity habituates and you start needing the next disruption. The people who seem to actually solve the problem land somewhere. I think it becomes increasingly more and more important to find find a group of people, find a set of people who are also in the same mindset of finding, of operating at the frontier that what can we do more, what can we do more, and constantly pushing the limits of yourself and what can be done. And because everything is built on a system, everything is built on a very strong foundation, on a very strong system where things, the lower level things get automated as you figure them out. This this breathes into a really strong ecosystem that keeps building, that keeps building, that keeps growing, that keeps refining itself. Very interesting. The entity of Krishna itself is in all. He is all the gods, the five elements: earth, air, fire, water, space. Earth, air, fire, water, space. All creatures, great or small, born of eggs or wombs of heat, of shoots, horses, cows, elephants, men and women, all beings that walk, all beings that fly, and all that neither walk nor fly. Perhaps the greatest contribution of the Upanishad is to open our eyes to what it really means to be a human being. The constant concern of the sages is to really awaken us to the sacred nature of the environment, of living creatures, of one another, finally of our own inner reality. This exalted vision of the human person has been echoed by the anonymous monk of 14th century England who has left us one of the world's greatest mystical documents, a cloud of unknowing. Beneath you and external to you lies the entire created universe. Yes, even the sun, the moon, and the stars, they are fixed above you. Beneath you and external to you lies the entire created universe. Yes, even the sun, the moon, and the stars, they are fixed above you, splendid in the firmament, yet they cannot be compared to your exalted dignity as a human being. There is nothing above you in nature except God Himself. How can this be? How can this minuscule, fragile body, whose size in the universe is beyond ludicrous, how do you say that? Be or contain such importance? Because the Upanishads and all the world's great mystics insist we are not the fragile body, but that which causes it to move, breathe, and be alive, consciousness. In this Upanishad, we have one of the four Mahavakyas or great utterances that later tradition teased out as the sum and substance of the teaching. Prajnam Brahma, all reality is consciousness. And the same consciousness is the life of all. Thus, we have the explanation for both the sanctity and the unity of life. The Atharya lays out the explanation by telling the story of evolution in the form of creation myth. Sees the driving force of evolution, desire. Or if we bear in mind that the sages understood desire to be precisely that, a force, rather than simply cravings or emotions, the myth is not so implausible. Happiness is the very nature of the self. Happiness and the self are not different. In truth, when its desires are fulfilled, it returns to its own place and enjoys the happiness